guidelines. When you go into assignments in lab, right, the playground binder guidelines are not complete right now. But what you need for the binder submission for midterm is complete. Okay? I just am changing some of the assignments for when we're out on the playground. And I haven't finished that yet. So the items that are required for the final submission to be added into the binder are not completed. Some of them you'll see are highlighted and scratched out. Okay? The TGMD, there's a folder for your BMI assignment that has information in there, and I will add the children's data once we've finished it on Friday, so you'll have what you need for the BMI assignment. And as I say, the sign-up sheet for the TGMD, that starts next Tuesday. There's availability, and I'll put that up this afternoon. So make sure that you go into the TGMD folder, read the requirements for that assignment, and then come and sign up, get your spot so that you don't miss out on that. It's got to be completed before we go out on the playground. Okay? All right, let's finish off chapter 5, and then on Friday we'll have a review session. If you've got any questions specifically, Friday's the time to go ahead and ask those if you want me to go over anything, and then we'll do some little activities to help you start thinking through the material and you're studying. Okay? I've been out on the playground this morning. All that sand. All right. Okay, so let's look at, we mentioned briefly on Monday the fact that the muscles have a tendon insertion on the bones, and so when we look at the relationship, when we're looking at growth, we've got a two-way street going on there. When you're older, right, when you're weight training and you're working your muscles, those muscles are pulling on the bone and stimulating the bone to lay down more bone cells and become heavier and denser and healthier. Right? During puberty, and we see that very fast growth in the skeleton, then the skeleton then tugs on the muscle, and that stimulates the muscle to lay down additional sarcomeres and grow longer. All right, so we see an interaction between these two different systems at different points. And remember that what we see going on there is going to affect the movement pattern that we see presented when we're watching that person move. Right? Something might change that's to do with the change in the system. Right? So the key, when we're looking at chapter 5, when you're reading chapter 5, keep in your head that the reason we're looking at this information that isn't immediate movement stuff, right, is because we want to know which of these changes are inevitable, right, because the system is getting older, because I'm aging, and which of the changes that we might see occur within a system are due to lifestyle choices that we make. Because then that's where us knowing about moving, us being able to help someone move more efficiently might have an impact. All right, so we looked at the skeleton, at the skeletal system, we looked at the muscular system, and the next one is the adipose system, so fat cells that we lay down. All right, fat plays a vital role in health and well-being. You can't have zero fat in your diet, and you can't have zero fat in your body. right? That's not possible. And if it's very, very low, that actually puts you at quite a high risk for some problems in a similar way to being very heavy, so it put you at risk for some health problems, right? So we don't want too little fat, because fat is a very good energy source for us, and it helps to keep us warm. So particularly the fat around our organs in our trunk plays a protective as well as a warmth role, right? We don't want those organs to get too cold. We have to keep our core temperature relatively stable, otherwise we get sick. So we need some fat in around there, and if I fall, I don't want my liver to hit the ground. That would be bad, right? So we want some fat around the organs to protect the organs if there's an accident.
So that's visceral, right?
That's visceral, internal visceral, yes. So, what we see then is fat cells start to be laid down prenatally around 3.5 months. You don't see a lot of them until months 8 and 9. And then there's rapid fat deposits on the fetus during months 8 and 9. So if any of you know anyone who's been pregnant recently or is pregnant now, if you watch, right, the belly stays relatively small until we get towards the end of month 7, and all of a sudden the stomach does this because the baby suddenly puts on a lot of fat cells and grows a lot, right? When they're born, on average 7.5 pounds, depending whether it's a boy or a girl, and about a pound, a little bit over a pound of that is going to be fat, right? So they don't have a lot of fat cells compared to what's coming, but most of that fat got put down in the last couple of months. Then we see over the first 6 months, from birth to 6 months old, a lot of fat being put down. So when babies are born, they're kind of crinkly and small, and then over the first couple of months they get all nice and pudgy and round, and their cheeks fill out, and they get those little pudgy wrinkles on their elbows and their knees and get really cute. Right? So up until 6 months then, very, very rapid, and then it doesn't stop. We keep depositing fat, but more gradually, kind of consistently, until around 8 years, until we hit puberty. So just before puberty, we've still got a relatively stable amount of fat cells being laid down. And then in puberty, everything goes kaplooey. If I'm a girl and I start releasing lots of estrogen stimulates fat deposition. So girls put on a lot more fat during puberty than boys do. Boys release tons of testosterone. That's a great muscle stimulator, so the boys put on a lot more muscle. Right? They both have both hormones. It's just different ratios. Boys are going to have a lot more testosterone, less estrogen. Girls are going to have a lot more estrogen, less testosterone. Right? And during this childhood phase of fat cell growth, we see both hyperplasia, increase in the number of cells that are going down, and hypertrophy, so the cells that are there get a little bit bigger, fill up with a bit more fat. All right? During that pubertal spurt, most of the fat cells, the growth in the fat cells, is due to the ones that are already there getting bigger. All right? And that's an important point, because what we know when we look at fat cells is that after puberty, when I'm putting on weight, mostly what I'm doing is putting more fat into cells that are already there. For an adult to lay down more fat cells, additional hyperplasia, they have to have a really pretty dramatic imbalance in calories. Right? It's actually quite difficult for adults to add fat cells. Can they? Yes, we see that, right? If I'm obese, there's hyperplasia going on.
Okay. It doesn't look like it's that difficult when you look at the American population and the Mexican population.
Right. Because they're over, the balance between how many calories they are exerting during the day and how many calories they're taking in is out of whack. And it gets to the point where all their fat cells that are already there kind of are full up, and they've still got all these additional calories, and so the body is stimulated to lay down additional fat cells.
So it's only muscle growth is hypertrophy. You can't have like muscle growth through hyperplasia.
Not very much. There's some research in cats that indicates there might be some. There's not a lot of research in humans. It's difficult to look at that.
How would
There's-
that be used?
If you stimulate the muscle, there's some indication that you might be able to split the muscle cell. So one muscle cell can become two. But as I say, they've seen it in cats, and they think they've seen it in bodybuilders. But it's difficult to look at muscle tissue in a person because you have to extract the muscle tissue, and that's uncomfortable. Right? And then it messes up their training, so it's difficult to get people to agree to have you take a muscle sample. Even though it's tiny, it's still uncomfortable and makes training difficult.
So you strain the muscle. That's what would happen if you took it out, right?
If you-
Strain it. Like you take a part of the muscle, it's not just a strain, even if it's minor, just because of that fat in the system.
I don't know if they would call it, if they would define it as a strain.
Just uncomfortable.
They take a tiny little sample from the belly of the muscle. I've never heard it defined as a strain. It's
sort of-
just sore, yeah. So it's interesting to look at this. When we look at the babies and the toddlers and the infants, fat babies don't mean they're going to be fat children, because everybody lays down these cells and grows at different rates, right? But it is interesting that we don't see a lot of hyperplasia in fat later on, right? Fat cells persevere. They don't go away once we've built them. So once they're there for life.
Unless that was
I can fill it up, I can empty it out, works like a balloon, right? So I can fill the balloon with water, I can tip the water out and it shrinks. I can fill it back up with water and it fills out. That's how a fat cell works. So what we don't know right now is what impact does the fat cells during the first few months have on a baby possibly being at more risk of being a fat adult. We do know that children who are overweight at 8 years old are 60%, somewhere around 60% more likely to be an overweight adult. Okay? Because once these cells are there, so if you visualize the cell, then I'm going to lay down my fat cells, and then we fill them up with additional calories laid down as adipose.
So the cells are the nurture part of it, and then the diet would be the nature.
Yeah,
So whatever.
to an extent. I mean, you're going to lay down some because everybody has to have fat. You can't work without fat. All your membranes are double lipid. Anybody done their biology or their anatomy lately? A membrane is a double lipid structure. A lipid is a fat. So I have to have fats. What happens when we get overweight is that possibly we can lay down some more of these. Certainly in childhood, I'm still able to lay down fat cells quite easily, right? And then I fill them up. Well, then you become a teenager, or you come to college and you get onto a training kick, you've got a good training partner, you've got a nice gym facility, and you start to lose weight, right? And you get leaner, I lose some fat mass, and we empty these cells out. But they don't go away.
It's just a reduction.
They don't go away. So then, if you resort back to a sedentary lifestyle, you've already got the storage space to fill them all back up again. Right? I don't have to worry about laying down additional fat cells as an adult if I was overweight as a child, because I've already got the additional fat cells there. So it's much easier then to become overweight again because I've already got the storage space. Okay. Once they're there, all you can do is drain them out. The potential to fill them back up again stays. So when you go on a diet and you lose fat, you don't lose the cell, you lose the fat. That means that I have to change my lifestyle. It can't be a short-term fix. Can't go on a diet and lose 10 pounds and then go back to the way I was living and eating before and not put the 10 pounds back on. The only way you can keep the fat off now is by changing the lifestyle permanently.
So is that the same for muscle?
No. No, muscle can break down. It's hard to lose muscle. It loses strength. So once you've built up the size of it, you can make the cell bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you stop training, it gets weaker, but it doesn't shrink very quickly. It takes a while. You're looking at a good year, 18 months before the muscle starts to really shrink. So when you give up training, don't go buy yourself a new wardrobe straight away, because you've got to let that muscle shrink down a bit first. All right, so the development of fat is a very interesting picture, because the implication for lifelong overweight obesity is tied up with the physiology of these fat cells. If they don't go away, then that means I can always get fat again. And as I said, what we see is that children who are 8 are often the ones that then become overweight adults as well, if they're overweight by 8. So what about distribution? So where is the fat? We know how it grows. Where do we put it? Right? Then children, when they're doing this growth spurt here, right, what we see is that they're laying that fat down mostly as visceral. So when you look at a 6-year-old, they're pretty lean. Like, they don't have a lot of fat, if they're healthy, on their arms and their legs. Okay. They tend to hold their fat more internally around their organs. Okay. And it goes down faster there than it does subcutaneously, which is also interesting to know, because yet, when you walk around Walmart, how many overweight children do you see? Right? In this town, a lot. If you keep your eyes open next time you're in Walmart and watch the children, right? Physiologically, their body does not want to put down fat on their arms and their legs. And yet, how many little people do you see wobbling around Walmart because their legs are so fat, their feet can't go together. Okay? It's a really massive problem because that's not what their body wants to do. This is purely lifestyle. And they're this big, so they're not choosing that lifestyle. An adult is doing that to them. Right? That's where I get.
Adults usually fat too.
Often the adult is also fat as well. Right? So it's a whole big ongoing problem that we're not making very much leeway with. Right? You guys are going to go out into the world hopefully and be PE teachers or trainers or coaches. You're going to be the ones to motivate children to move more so that maybe we can have some impact on this picture, because we're not doing a very good picture right now. It's really bad right now. From the age of 6 or 7, we start to see more subcutaneous fat being put down until they go into puberty, and then for girls, subcutaneous fat increases a lot more. Okay, so they tend to put their fat down on their legs and their arms, particularly their legs, and around their butt. Boys, when they're laying down fat during puberty, tend to put it on more around their viscera and their trunk. Okay. So this then causes a bit of a problem because the girls might be self-conscious about having fatter legs or fatter arms, and that encourages them not to exercise, right? They have flabby arms. They're already less active than boys when they go into puberty, and that picture just gets worse as we get older. So adult females, on the whole, are way less active than adult males, partly because of the role women tend to play, right? We don't have a lot of women firefighters or a lot of women on building sites or, right? Typically those roles are male, and those roles burn calories, and the girl's role, sit and type in, doesn't burn calories. Right? So the kinds of jobs that we pick as we're older also play a role in what we see happen. Then as we get older, when you guys come to college and then when you leave college, we see a tendency to gain fat. So remember our big picture curve, right? Genetically, there would be no reason for the weight curve not to flatline the same way a height curve does. But it's much more variable because I can go to the gym and train like crazy and put on loads of muscle. Well, then my weight would go up. Or I can be a sedentary person and eat McDoodles for breakfast, right? And then my weight goes up. So weight is much more variable depending upon what I choose to do as an adult. Okay? On average, between the ages of 20 and 50, a woman is going to put on somewhere around 26 pounds. So that's a lot of weight, right? That's a pound a year. Doesn't seem like very much, but over time, that pound a year adds up to a lot of additional weight. For a guy, over that same period, 20 to 30, it's about 18 pounds. So we're not very good at maintaining the weight that we were when we were in our late teens, even though mostly we stopped growing. Okay? So that weight fluctuation is to do with other things. Again, you guys are not typical, right? So it's difficult sometimes to think about, well, I didn't put on 10 pounds since I came to college, right? Or I'm gonna go and I'm gonna be a personal trainer. So the only weight I'm gonna put on would be muscle mass or bone mass. Right, but you're not typical. Typically, people become more sedentary as they get older, just because of the way we structure our lifestyle. It's difficult to fit in exercise when you're really, really busy. We see our redistribution because we see more increases in the trunk fat again, and often we see subcutaneous fat go down a little bit, particularly on men. So where the fat is changes during this 20 to 40, 50 age range. Right? So if you watch guys, they tend to get rounder and rounder and rounder here, right? But their legs get thin and skinny. Okay? So then we start to see odd waist to hip ratios. Now, mechanically then, what does this do to my center of gravity? It does. Shifts it out. Yeah, men more, but women do. Right? And visceral fat is another thing to pay attention to. This internal visceral fat has a much higher risk, linking it to cardiovascular disease and other diseases, type 2 diabetes, than subcutaneous fat does. So you want this to stay as small. If you start to put on some weight around here, that is much less health risk than if you're putting on weight around your belly. So, as I get older, we put on some fat. Everybody is going to put on some. Do I have to put on 26 pounds? No. An active adult will put on way less fat than a sedentary adult. 26 pounds of fat. Just imagine that. This isn't muscle or bone, that's 26 pounds of fat. So the next time you buy a steak and you cut the fat, or you get a chicken breast and you cut the fat off the chicken, imagine that being 26 pounds. And then we wonder why our healthcare costs are not good. And people aren't healthy and people aren't moving because it's hard to move. Right? Pick up a 10-pound bag of potatoes. When you go into Walmart, right, potatoes are right there. So the first thing, next time you go to Walmart, go over and pick up a 10-pound bag of potatoes and spend the rest of your shopping trip in Walmart carrying the 10-pound bag of potatoes and see how that feels. Okay? And that would be just 10 pounds more than you are now. Imagine if you're someone that is carrying 60 pounds or 100 pounds more than they should be. It's not simple just to say, well, you've got to exercise. Because it's difficult to exercise if you're 100 pounds heavier than you need to be.
Nutrition is the key to success.
Nutrition plays a role. That is true. Nutrition does play a role. All right, so in your textbook then, the next system is the endocrine system. So it looks at hormones and it looks at the thyroid. Make sure that you look at that. I don't have time to cover everything. So make sure that you look at the endocrine system and what's going on with the development of the endocrine system. Okay. And then the next system is the nervous system. So the nervous system is very strongly linked to your genetics. Genetics drives the genes in your body, drive the development of the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. All right? So the structure of the nervous system and the main circuitry of the system around the body and in your brain is driven by the genes, right? But what we're finding out more and more is that it is possible to influence what is going on in the nervous system based upon the amount of experiences we give an individual, right? Not just a child, but even adults can change the wiring in their brain based upon a new activity that they pick up, right? So the formation of synaptic connections, we have trillions of synaptic connections in our brains, right? Trillions. And we're fine-tuning those connections all the time. So the little wiring. Okay? Remember in lab, I asked you to read an article about the windows of opportunity. So when we're looking at motor skills and when we're looking at young children, we have these windows of opportunity when I can best wire the brain to learn a fundamental motor skill. For gross skills, that window shuts around 5 to 6. Right? So running, jumping, catching, throwing. My brain's best capability for forming the synaptic connections in the brain to make that skill efficient shuts around 5 or 6. Fine motor skills shuts around 9 or 10. Prenatally, neural development is, we've got to actually form nerve cells, right? So we've got to make the nerve cells first of all, and they differentiate into a general type. So are they going to be a brain cell? Are they going to be a skin cell? Are they going to be a heart cell? Right? What are they going to be? And then they have to migrate within that little embryo and fetus to where they're going to set root and become what they're meant to be. All right? So we make about 200 billion or so initially, and then we don't use them all. We are born with about 100 billion nerve cells in our brains when we're born. So by month 3 or 4, we've got almost all our neurons. We overmake them actually. So we make more than we need, so we can cut some back if they're not doing a good job. Okay. And once they're in place, so they've got to migrate to where they're going to be. So once they're in place, most of them are in where they need to be in the body by about 6 months. So when the fetus is 6 months old, most of the neural system is in place. Okay. Then they're going to start to develop an axon that can carry the signal away from the nerve cell to the next nerve cell or to the organ. And they start to develop dendrites, and we start to see connections forming. Right? So quite late in the prenatal period, those electrons start to carry signals. They start to fire and carry an electrical impulse. So we don't see that early on. That's why we don't see any movement or anything in the baby early on, because there's no nervous system in place to carry a signal to make anything move. Okay. So it's quite late on that the neural system is more organized to the point where it can start to carry an electrical impulse. Right? And some of that organization is due to the environment, even prenatally. We said, you know, what's mum's nutrition like? What's the environment in the womb like? Is it supportive of this process occurring? Or is it having a negative impact and stopping these nerve cells from migrating to where they need to be and do their job properly? Okay. So neural networks become more efficient with experience. We can prune them, we're tweaking them all the time. When you're born, your brain is around about 25% of its adult weight, right? Now, we just said almost all the nerve cells are in place. So the increase in weight is not because we put more nerve cells in our brains. It's because we start to make the nerve cells that are there bigger. We start to expand these dendrites and the connections from one nerve cell to another nerve cell, or we might make a pathway to a nerve cell all the way over the other side of the brain, right? So by the time we're 4, our brain is about 80% of its adult weight. So all that growth, 25 to 80%, all that growth is making connections because of experiences, right? Allowing different parts of the brain to talk to each other. All right? So more branching, we get more branching at the end of the axon as well. Glial cells are little cells that sit around with the nerve cell and provide nutrition. Here's our myelination that we were talking about. So it's a fatty substance that lays down around the axon, and it allows for faster transmission of the electrical signal. Right? So myelin sheaths are there initially. We add them as we get older. And we're changing these synapses constantly throughout the lifespan. Right? We prune them away, we build another pathway. If we don't use it very often, we get rid of it. If we use it a lot, we strengthen the connection along that pathway. And what we know is that stimulation of learning, if I'm learning something new, that increases these connections around the brain. Right? So we're looking at learning movement skills, but any kind of learning stimulates additional synaptic connections in the brain, right? And strengthens pathways that already exist. So learning more math, or learning about how a tree grows, or why the clouds are that shape today. Anything is going to increase synaptic connections in the brain. Right? Learning then is an extrinsic factor that influences the structure of the nervous system. Right? Poor nutrition would be an external factor that could stunt growth in the brain. Right? And if we're looking at poor nutrition in a young child, certainly younger than 4, then that stunted growth may not be recoverable later on. That child may never develop a full-size brain. Like it would never be full adult weight, maybe. Right? And never make all the connections they could have made because of poor nutrition when they were younger. We're learning so much about what goes on in the brain now. We've got MRIs, we're able to actually see different parts of the brain firing. Right? And what they see when they look at MRIs is that part of the brain that is used a lot expands in size. Right? We lay down a lot more synaptic connections in that part of the brain. So we exercise a lot, we've got lots of synapses between our sensory and our motor cortex. Maybe I exercise and I don't read. Well, then the part of my brain that is used for reading might cut some synapses back, because that's not something we do. We don't provide that experience. When we're born, the spinal cord and lower brain centers, right, areas of the brain that are responsible for digestion or for breathing, right, unconscious kinds of things that the body has to do, those are pretty advanced. The higher area of the brain, the cortex, thinking, cognition, understanding, not going on when we're born, right? So once we're born and we start to have experiences and interaction in the outside world, we start to see changes in the function of the cortex. It's pretty gradual, right? Initially, the motor cortex is functioning around, we start to see deliberate voluntary movement around 4 to 5 months, depending on the child, right? So they start to reach out. They'll miss, right? But if you have a toy or you shake something in front of them, they'll start to reach. That's deliberate voluntary movement. That indicates the motor cortex is functioning. Right? Before that, we don't see voluntary movement. Myelination of the axons, particularly when we're looking at the motor cortex, the motor neurons, that occurs across, well, by the time they're 4 or 5, we're starting to see a lot more myelination. So if you think of what a 2-year-old looks like when they're walking versus a 5-year-old, right? Part of that change in walking is because now the brain can talk to the muscles a lot more quickly. So I'm able to get the muscles to react faster, and that changes the pattern. Myelination can increase the speed of transmission up to 150 times in some nerves. Right? So now I don't have to wait. Okay? If you ever see anyone with multiple sclerosis, their movements are very jerky and uncoordinated, because what happens in multiple sclerosis is the myelination deteriorates. The fatty sheath starts to break down, and that slows the transmission of the signal from the brain. So now bits of the body move out of coordination with each other, right? Or don't move if they develop very, if it develops very negatively for them. Okay, when we look at aging, there's lots of information on young children. We know that when we're working with you guys, you can learn new skills quite well and quite easily. So clearly you're able to make new synapses between areas of the brain quite effectively, otherwise you wouldn't be able to learn anything, right? And as we get older, it starts to get a little bit more difficult. Right? It's not that I can't do it. Traditionally, we've always thought, well, neurons maybe die off, right? We don't have as much of the chemicals that are necessary, perhaps, to help the signal transmit. But the brain and the central nervous system have a lot of plasticity. So if I try to exercise it, it has ways of rebuilding pathways, right? So if I have a pathway that goes from point A in my brain to point B in my brain that allows me to learn a skill, and my pathway goes like this, then maybe what happens as we get older, one of the ideas is that part of the pathway, the link in the pathway breaks. right? So now that signal can't get through, and we see slowing, or we see confusion, or we see forgetfulness, right? And what they think might happen is that the brain's able to recreate a pathway, but it has to take another route, and that slows the signal down. What they're finding is that vigorous exercise in an elderly population promotes improved cognitive function. So, for several reasons, maybe. One, I get a lot more blood flow to the brain. That means I get more glucose to the brain, I get more oxygen to the brain. Two, when we exercise, we see increase in brain proteins. So there are specific proteins that are responsible for maintaining or building pathways in the brain. Okay.
And what about like supplementation with like DHA and omega-3s and others? Do you think that would be a big factor in helping cognitive function?
Omega-3s help with joint mobility and things like that. I think they might help with brain health, but I don't know enough about supplementation. I know a little bit about the mechanism. So if I've got more proteins, I can maintain the pathway or I can build a new pathway. So vigorous exercise has been shown to make quite a big difference. It's one of the most important factors when you meet someone who's older, who's very alert, who's very with it. Chances are they're also very active. Elderly people who are more sedentary tend to not be quite as sharp. Doing crossword puzzles helps as well, because then I'm still learning. I'm still challenging the brain lets you. So I need to maintain the dendrite branches in the brain. I need to be able to maintain metabolism, because all this work that the brain does takes energy, and I have to be able to make energy. Right? And exercising allows both those things to occur more effectively. So now we have another reason. It's not just maintaining my balance and not falling over. Now it's, do I want to stay mentally alert? All of these things play a role in quality of life as we get older, because if I'm not mentally alert, then maybe I go and buy the wrong stuff for dinner when I go to Walmart. Or some person who has an ulterior motive and may not be very kind comes to my door and says, well, if you write me a check, I'll come back and clean your windows tomorrow. And you write them a check, and of course they don't come back and clean your windows tomorrow. Right? But you weren't sharp enough, you weren't with it enough to go, yeah, clean my windows, and then I'll give you a check. Okay? So, big impact on quality of life, what we see going on in the brain. All right? So, Friday, remember, come ready if you've got questions. Friday's your opportunity to ask questions, clear up anything that is confusing.